Good afternoon, and thank you for coming, those of you who decided to. Last week, the Orange County District Attorney's Office filed a civil lawsuit against the Board of Parole Hearings on behalf of the state of California, and also on behalf of crime victim Colleen Campbell, who's here with me this afternoon, and we requested a hearing date. This office is seeking relief against the board for violating Marsy's law by allowing administrative staff to advance the parole hearing to inmate Lawrence Rayburn Cowell without new evidence. Cowell was convicted in 1983 of murdering Colleen's 27-year-old son, Scott Campbell. When Cowell threw him out of an airplane and into the ocean, Cowell serving a life term in prison, he was found unsuitable for parole at the most recent hearing. That was in October 25th, 2016, and yet the board unlawfully advanced the date of his next parole hearing by a year to May 23rd, 2018, and they failed to adequately notify Colleen Campbell of the new hearing date, which is required under Marsy's law. Here to talk about Marsy's law is Colleen. So we're going to talk about Marsy's law a little bit, but I just wanted to say that Colleen Campbell's with me here, and we're going to invite Colleen to the stage. And Colleen is she's at the stage, but to the mic. Colleen is a survivor of multiple crimes committed against her loved ones. She lost her son, her brother, and her sister-in-law to murderers. But instead of turning the pain inward, she spent years of her life advocating for victims and fighting for their rights. And so, Colleen, if you would step forward, I know you have a few words.
I don't have anything planned to say at all. I came up in a law enforcement family. My father was chief of detectives on the Alhambra Police Department. So I grew up knowing exactly what you're supposed to do and doing it right, and so did my brother. Unfortunately, I went to work at a bank right after I graduated from high school and met a very nice couple named Jean and Laverne Cowell, who today are both deceased. But they had two children that we took water skiing with us and had a lot of fun, and I would help the kids up skiing, and of course that was many years ago. However, when my son was 27 years old, the son, Lawrence Rayburn Cowell, asked my son to take an airplane ride with him, saying he was getting his pilot's license, and the instructor said he could take a friend along. So Scott was excited about it, and he had mentioned that he was going, but I didn't know when or anything. And then all of a sudden, I couldn't get him on the phone, and he wasn't calling me. And I went crazy trying to find out what happened to my son. And it took 7 months of Gary and I searching our heads off, hunting for our son, before we found out that his friend, so-called friend, had strangled him and threw him out of an airplane so they could steal his sports car. Now my brother, Mickey Thompson, who was later murdered also, found Scott's sports car in the Cowell shop, and they filed the numbers off, but they could identify it. So he was finally brought to justice. He had killed one other person in a drunk driving accident, but he was given life in prison. But constantly we're coming up against parole hearings, and it's a long drive to the different prisons that he's been in, and on several occasions we've got there, and they've said, well, we're canceling the parole hearing, or you can come back some other time, or whatever. The last parole hearing we went clear to Northern California and had to stay all night because the parole hearing was at 8 o'clock in the morning. And Gary and I were up in years, and it was a 5-hour drive, and went in, sat there, and they said, parole hearing's canceled. But if you have something to say it now. And I said, well, is this the same parole board that we'll have at the next parole hearing? Well, we don't know. And I said, well, what's the use of talking to people that aren't going to be there? It's up to you. And that's how victims are treated on the parole hearing. And we came back home and went back up to the parole hearing. And unfortunately, my husband has passed away. And we went to a parole hearing in November, and in October. And it's supposed to be another 3 years before there was a parole hearing, but they've moved it up, of course, and saying it's coming up right away. What happens to victims is very unfair. We're hurting anyway, and we're trusting the justice system and the parole board to help us get through the stress. But more often than not, those parole hearings are changed or canceled after you've driven the distance and sat there. And it's something that needs to be changed. If a killer is supposed to have a parole hearing at such a time, that's when they're supposed to have the parole hearing. And the family can plan on it with their work ethic and taking care of children or dogs or whatever you have to take care of. But what's going on in the state of California to victims, and I'm not alone, believe me, all of the victims say the same thing, is very unfair and very demeaning to a family that's already hurting anyway. I did bring a picture of our son, Scott Campbell, that was murdered. Scott was very special in our life. And of course, we weren't even able to have a funeral because we couldn't find his body. And it was 7 months before we learned what had happened. In addition to our only son being murdered, my only sibling, auto racing legend Mickey Thompson, and his wife were also murdered. And for a while, the killer had access to the computer and was putting out horrible things about me, all lies, of course, and untruths. So something needs to be done. Something needs to be changed. The good people are getting knocked around. The law enforcement officers that go to the trouble of arresting these people and the prosecutors that get them convicted, and then they get up in Sacramento or wherever they are, and we have this kind of treatment. So I just wanted to be clear. If there's any questions, I'll try to answer them. I'm legally blind now, so I can't read notes, and it's hard for me to remember every date. But anything anybody wants to ask.
Could you speak a little louder? I'm sorry. You know what? We're taping this for our social media, so we're going to give you a microphone. If you could speak into the microphone and state your name, and then who you're with.
Sean Emery with the Orange County Register.
Mm-hmm.
Colleen, how did you learn that they had moved up the date, and kind of how did that information come to you?
We got an email.
And when was that?
It's probably been about a month ago. I don't remember the exact date.
Can you talk about, Colleen,
You know, wait, I take that back. I'm not positive it was an email. It may have been a letter. Not reading myself, having somebody read everything to me. I don't have it in my hand, and it's a little confusing. Excuse me?
And Colleen, Eileen Frere with KABC TV, Channel 7. If you could tell me when you got that, whether it was an email or a message, what did you think when you first read that? I mean, were you thinking this has to be a mistake or what?
No, being in the justice system for as long as I have, I thought they're doing it again. It made me very angry, and my first thought was they know that Gary's dead, and I would have a hard time getting there. And it's not something you trust. It's not where you can say they're really checking to see whether this person is ready to get out to be with civilization again.
And can you talk about, I mean, it's got to be an incredible stress every time you have to go before a hearing and see him. Can you talk about that for help people understand who haven't been through that?
Well, it's always very stressful. It's hard to be a nice lady when you're looking at the killer of your child. But we always have followed the rules and regulations and tried to be there. And it's a hard thing because you've got the defense attorney there that's trying to give you all kind of stuff that isn't true, and of course you've lived it, so it's hard.
Hi, Pat Maloma, Crime Watch Daily with Chris Hansen. What's the motive behind this? Is there a political motive? What does it behoove the parole board to behave in this way?
I have no idea. You would think that they would certainly want to be very fair to the victim and fair to the inmate, and it's not. It's very lopsided.
May I ask Mr. Rokakis, do you have any thoughts about the motivation behind it?
I've thought about a lot of things, but I can't prove it. When people are doing things that you feel are wrong and illegal and against good judgment, it makes you wonder why they're doing it.
Thank you, Colleen. Don't go away, but thank you.
I'd like to go away.
All right. Well, so I wanted to thank Colleen for sharing her personal story of loss and how it's impacted and continues to impact her life. So this lawsuit, what this is about really is a violation of Marsy's law, and Marsy's law is something along the lines of a victim's bill of rights, and it has the attribute of giving the victims of crime, the loved ones of the victims of crime, in a case like this where there's a murder, some rights in court, rights to be heard in court, rights to be present. It lifts the rights of victims to a constitutional level to allow them to have a voice, and it applies to parole hearings as well as it does to court proceedings. And so what we have here is a circumstance where Marsy's law is actually being violated, and not even by the board of parole hearings, but by the administrative staff, employees who are not appointed and not responsible to anyone. So in this case, after the board made a decision to deny parole for a 3-year term, somebody on the administrative staff, a bureaucrat, changed that and advanced it for a year. Now, when we started looking into this, what happened here, we learned that it wasn't just this case. This is being done on a regular basis on a lot of cases, advancing these parole dates, violating Marsy's law, and giving people parole dates at hearings that are not authorized by the Board of Prison Terms. So what could happen here could easily be if this defendant Cal gets a hearing. What can happen here is he could get a parole date at a hearing that's not even authorized by law, and so that's what we're fighting against here, and that's why we brought this lawsuit. When you think about the harm and you see what these poor people who are victims of crime have to go through, it just, it makes you cry, really, because they're victimized by some terrible crime, and they go through all of the terrible things that happen in court, watch all of the cross-examinations, see all of the things that take place, and finally, if there's a conviction, they think justice is finally taken place, then then you have the parole hearing state. Well, after the appeals and so forth, they have all that, but then they also have the parole hearings, and these people like the Campbells are making their way up to the prison for the parole hearing and going through all the trauma that's presented at a parole hearing and doing all of the things that they're supposed to do, and so we expect the Board of Prison Terms to follow the law. So I'm pleased to say that Dr. Henry Nicholas is here. Dr. Henry Nicholas III is present, and his sister Marsy was murdered, and Dr. Nicholas is the architect of Marsy's Law. And I think, Dr. Nicholas, you might have a few words that you'd like to say. If you would please step forward.
Thank you. So, let me raise this up. Both work. You're too short. All right. The thing to consider here, we're not just dealing with law. We're dealing with constitutional rights. Marsy's Law was passed because the system had somehow lost track that when you're dealing with basic inalienable rights, our Constitution has provided early on the constitutional rights for someone that's accused of a crime or someone that's convicted. You have certain inalienable rights. And that's what we're dealing with here is the early release of prisoners because their quality of life is overcrowding. It's not as good as maybe it should be. The reason why Marsy's Law is important and the reason why its constitutionality is important is because now for the first time we can balance that right of a criminal to have a quality of life not being overcrowded against the quality of life of a victim to have certain certainty in the sentence of this criminal, and also to not have to relive that crime every year or every 2 years. And so we provide, first of all, through Marsy's Law, the constitutionality, which means it must be weighed against these other rights by a judge. But also, it provides for certain inalienable rights. In other words, there is a certain minimum beneath which you should not have to revisit this crime. And that is established within the Constitution at 3 years. And what's going on right now in the state is they are undermining those constitutional rights that we as the citizens of California have. And it's vitally important, if there's to be any rule of law, that there needs to be some injunctive release and that we need to ensure that our state follows and does not infringe upon the constitutional rights that we have as crime victims.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there are any additional questions, we could try to handle those. There was one question that was left dangling about the motivation, and let me just say, as far as the motivation of the individuals who are doing this, that results in a violation of Marsy's Law, it's hard to know what the motivation of a particular individual might be. However, over the last few years, we've been going through a time in this state of the wholesale release of prisoners, and laws have been made, like Prop 57, for example, have been created to reduce the number of people in prison. And so, that was accompanied with a lot of people being released early from prison, and in a lot of cases where people would ordinarily have been sentenced to prison or in the past would have been sentenced to prison can no longer be sentenced to prison. Thousands of cases where people would have gone back to prison for parole violations can no longer be sent back to prison for parole violations, but would have to be handled in the county for a relatively short time period. So there's a whole process going of reducing the population of state prison. Now it's at a level now that is that's pretty well reduced from where it was, and certainly within the law that was required by a 3-judge federal court that made those requirements. But we still have that pressure, and I see this as a part of that because it's a continuation of this movement to get people out of prison, and so that's what I think we're seeing here. Colleen, excuse me.
Interesting enough, both the people that killed our son and my brother and his wife should have been in prison if the rules were followed at the time of the murder, and my family would be alive.
I have a quick question for the district attorney in the back here. Sorry. Hey. Corbin Carson, KFIM 640. Just if you could break down the merits of this lawsuit specifically as to was it because the victim was not notified within a proper time, or was it because it was within that 3 years? It wasn't the full 3 years that the doctor mentioned? And how are you seeing that in other cases?
Right. The lawful authority was to have another parole hearing in 3 years, and that was undermined by the staff advancing that parole hearing for a year and setting a date 2 years instead of 3 years. So that's a violation, and the notification to the victim that's required under Marsy's law was also defective, and additionally, this whole problem of requiring people who are the victims of crime to come to more parole hearings at more frequent times is certainly a violation of their rights, and particularly their rights as outlined under Marsy's law. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your time and your attention, and thank you.